Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So, a few weeks ago, President Biden did something pretty historic. He formally apologized to the indigenous people in America for the 150 years that the US government operated boarding schools that abused, killed, and erased the identity of Native American children. And even though this is a small step, it's an important one. The first part of providing reparations for any historical injustice is to acknowledge it and apologize for it. And Biden was absolutely correct when he said that these Indian boarding schools are one of the most horrific chapters in American history. These schools opened in the 1800s as a way to fast track the cultural genocide of Native Americans. When Raphael Lemkin coined the word genocide in 1942, he said that there are two types of genocide, physical and cultural. Physical genocide is the destruction of the body, whereas cultural genocide is the destruction of the soul. Lemkin explained that cultural genocide is the destruction of those structures and practices that allow the group to continue as a group. States that engage in cultural genocide set out to destroy the political and social institutions of the targeted group. In their war against indigenous people, Americans engaged in both types of genocide. Vigilantes, militias, and the US military frequently slaughtered indigenous people. And the history of this country is littered with atrocities and massacres, such as the 1864 Sand Creek Massacre in Colorado and the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota. But Americans also engaged in cultural genocide. From 1819 to 1969, U.S. government agencies kidnapped at least 18,000 indigenous children and placed them in over 400 boarding schools across the country. And the goal was to completely erase and eradicate their identity and culture. At these schools, the goal was to destroy everything that made Native Americans who they were. At these schools, indigenous children were given new names. They were forbidden from speaking their native language. They were forbidden to practice their religion. They were forbidden from wearing their traditional clothing. Here's a photograph of some of these children before they started attending one of these boarding schools. And here's the after picture showing the transformation. The goal of these schools was to turn indigenous people into proper U.S. citizens, which meant turning them into conservatives, Christians, and capitalists who worshiped the American gods of money and private property. Basically, indigenous culture was seen as a disease that needed to be eradicated, and the only antidote was a strong dose of whitewashed Americanism. That's why the official motto of these schools was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." However, recent studies have shown that these schools were not about kill the Indian, save the man. They were just about kill the Indian. A few years ago, researchers started discovering that there were mass graves behind many of these schools, where the bodies of indigenous children were discarded after they died from neglect or abuse. In 2022, investigations found that at least 500 indigenous children were buried in these unmarked graves. But just 2 years later, that number had risen to nearly 1,000. And as more work is done, that number is certain to rise. The true number is probably closer to what we've seen recently in Canada. A Canadian report described their country's forced schooling of Aboriginal children as cultural genocide. And experts say that there may be thousands of indigenous children buried in unmarked graves at these schools. It's important that the U.S. has followed Canada in acknowledging this dark history. When Biden apologized for the government's role in running these schools, he said that these schools left Native communities silenced. Their children's laughter and play were gone. Children abused emotionally, physically, and sexually abused, forced into hard labor. Some put up for adoption without the consent of their birth parents. Some left for dead in unmarked graves. He concluded that no apology can or will make up for what was lost during the darkness of the federal boarding school policy, but we're finally moving forward into the light. However, it's also important to acknowledge that the discrimination and abuse of indigenous people is not just part of America's past, but part of our present too. This is a war that is still being fought. Even though the practice of Indian boarding schools ended in 1969, as recently as 2011, reports found that nearly 700 Native American children in South Dakota are being removed from their homes on reservations every year and placed with foster families, sometimes under questionable circumstances. Today, Indigenous people still face generational trauma, leading to higher rates of poverty, addiction, and Indigenous people taking their lives at far higher rates than other Americans. The violence against Indigenous people is often overlooked too. Indigenous women are assaulted and murdered at far higher rates than other women, and Indigenous people are killed by police officers at higher rates than any other American ethnic group. Indigenous people are still fighting to defend their sacred land, which is constantly under attack. Most importantly, Indigenous people are still fighting for their land that was violently stolen from them and deserves to be returned. Clearly, much more is needed than an apology to right the wrongs done to Native Americans. And as we work toward this place of true justice, it would be wise to remember that there is still much that we can learn from Indigenous people. In fact, I would argue that if the human species wants a future on this planet, it is absolutely essential to go back to the way that Indigenous people saw the earth and treated their environment. For many Indigenous people, the earth itself was sacred and divine. It was something to respect and live in harmony with, not something to abuse and profit off of. This is what Black Elk was talking about in 1932, when he described how Americans had taken the beautiful circle of life and trapped it in a suffocating box. He explained, "You have noticed that everything an Indian does is in a circle, and that is because the power of the world always works in circles, and everything tries to be round. In the old days, when we were a strong and happy people, all our power came to us from the sacred hoop of the nation, and so long as the hoop was unbroken, the people flourished. Everything the power of the world does is done in a circle. The sky is round, and I have heard that the earth is round like a ball, and so are all the stars. The wind, in its greatest power, whirls. Birds make their nest in circles, for theirs is the same religion as ours. The sun comes forth and goes down again in a circle. The moon does the same, and both are round. Even the seasons form a great circle, and they're changing, and always come back again to where they were. The life of a man is a circle, and so it is in everything where power moves. Our teepees were round like the nest of birds, and these were always set in a circle, the nation's hoop, a nest of many nests, where the Great Spirit meant for us to hatch our children. But the white men have put us in these square boxes. Our power is gone and we are dying, for the power is not in us anymore." This is the real tragedy of America's Indian boarding schools. They not only destroyed so many lives, they destroyed a way of life, an alternative to this industrialized corporate nightmare that we live in now. These schools took a beautiful circle and turned it into an ugly square. And now we're all stuck in these boxes, living lives that we were not meant to live. None of this American life around us is normal or natural. This is not the way life was meant to be. America is the anomaly and the aberration, and one day this empire will fall just like all empires do. What will never fall is Turtle Island. What will never fade is the indigenous spirit that was on this land for thousands of years before the first European ever stepped foot here with their Bibles and their guns, claiming that their way of life was the only way. In our heart and in our souls, we know that this is not true.